plague brings two ways of dying, one bodily by infection, the other to the soul by fear, and thus by separation. Words connect or separate, depending upon love or fear. This is neither magic nor rational certainty. It is better. If you wish, your words can be my breath, and my words can be your breath. Breathe for each other with fearless words, even across mountains and oceans. This way, your words will carry love, joy, and peace. Let your words spread wildly, a crazy panempathy. They may not stop the first way of dying, but they will stop the second. It is up to you. Keep saying I love you. You are a joy to me. I love you. You are a joy to me. This is a poem sent to me in the last couple days by my uncle, my mother's little brother, Kevin Haddock, who's a beautifully eloquent poet. And these words inspired me in the times that we are currently in under the coronavirus pandemic. The poem is called Panempathy, which I think is pretty awesome. You can find more of Kevin's poetry at blueheronpoetry.com. I will put this in the show notes. And I thought of starting this episode with a poem, partly because I can hear some beautiful choral music in that poetry, if any of you are composers out there. And speaking of composing, the topic of this episode is becoming a composer, advice on becoming a composer. Ryan Main, who is one of the show's sponsors, is the guest on the show today, and Ryan's story is interesting because it very much ties in to this idea of using the inspiration of the moment to start creating something new. Ryan was a classroom middle school choir teacher for years and started noticing that there were things that his students needed that didn't exist. So what Ryan did was he started creating things for his students and then realizing that other people liked what he created for his students because he was seeing something that the market wasn't providing in the area of choral music and went out and created something new. In this time of being locked down in your house and a lot of you sitting in front of your computer screens a lot more than you are used to doing, this might be the perfect time for many of you if you have always kind of dreamed about writing something or creating something for your students, whether it be as your job, like it is now for Ryan, or just something that you can use in your own classroom. This conversation is going to offer a lot of advice for you and a lot of maybe encouraging words to where you've got the time now, sit down and create something new. And maybe it's just for your kids, but maybe we'll like it too. And he's got advice for you too there about how to get it out there to people. And kind of he tells his story about what his transition from classroom teacher to being a full-time composer and creator of choral materials and music on his website. So I think I recorded the conversation with Ryan in my house. So before you freak out, we recorded this on February 23rd. I'd kept it in the can for a while before we knew all the rules that we can't have people over to our houses right now, at least in the area that I live. So when you see us on the YouTube channel, possibly sitting together in my studio, this was before the stay-at-home orders, just to be clear. And I think you will find that the conversation ended up being very timely because there's a lot of things that are going to be discussed in this conversation that you could possibly apply to your life right now. So I hope you enjoy the conversation coming up soon with Ryan Main. Episode 31, Stuck at Home? Become a Composer with Ryan Main is brought to you today, obviously, by reinvent.com. I'm not going to tell you much about reinvent.com because you're about to hear a bunch about Ryan's story and about what Ryan does. Also, this episode is going to be brought to you by Sight Reading Factory because I do need to tell you how Sight Reading Factory has been going for me for the last week as an online teacher. So many of you have heard me discuss how I use Sight Reading Factory in my classroom, which is I'm very proud of. The process we've developed for using Sight Reading Factory in the classroom is very effective, and I stand by it, and we're going to go back to that as soon as we possibly can. I've had to reinvent the process with Sight Reading Factory over the last week with some successes and some failures. So as many of you know, Sight Reading Factory has individual student accounts, which my kids have, which is great, and we've mostly used them in the past when we're in school every day as a way for kids to practice and prepare for in-class things. Because I personally am not a big fan of online sight reading grading. And the reason for that is I prefer to be in the room with the kid, giving them feedback in the moment. And now I'm kicking myself because I haven't recorded any examples of me doing that so I can explain that to you. Now I wish I could see my kids in person and do this again, because one of the downsides of doing it online, as I see it, is it takes away the opportunity to hear how they're singing as a possible cause of why they're making a mistake. And I'm a big believer in that there's a lot of kids, so think of it this way, you can sing the wrong what, but if you don't consider the why, you might not get the right answer. So a student might sing the wrong interval. Let's say they're trying to go from a do to a so, and they only get from do to mi, and your instinct might be to tell them simply that they sang the wrong note. And if when you're grading it kind of coldly online, that's really all you can see. You can't give the kid immediate feedback. Now in my classroom, I would probably notice that the reason that the student didn't get all the way up the fifth was a breath support issue and not an ear issue. Had they simply connected to their breath and sang with a more resonant tone, then they would have found that fifth a whole lot easier. And so in this environment where we're teaching online, that's been a struggle. A lot of my students are emailing me saying, I'm missing notes and that I don't feel like I would miss at school. Well, at school, I'm there to tell you, hey, how did you sing that exercise just now? Describe the tone quality. Oh, it was kind of breathy and it was kind of off, not very supported. Okay, fix that. And then in almost every case at school, the student will then fix the note. They'll fix the pitch. Okay, so that's been the downside. I prefer to help my students in person and grade them in person. So we've been using these Sight Reading Factory accounts in the past as an at-home practice tool only. I don't give assignments through it on a regular basis. Now, throughout the course of this week, though, we've started giving assignments because that's really one of the best tools we have right now, and I do like it. I'm actually starting to like it. I'm just having to figure out how to assess it when I can't help them get back on track. All right, so that's been a challenge, but I also really think it's good for the kids to have to line themselves up with that cursor and not stop no matter what, and all of the things that might be a little bit different than how we do it in class. So I think going forward, once we're back in class, I'll probably start doing some kind of a mixture of those things. So I'm finding it beneficial to my students, even though we've had to go online. A lot of you guys saw my It's Okay to Suck at Being an Online Choir Teacher thing. I've had to reevaluate and post new expectations for these assignments every day. Because we're figuring it out. Every day that goes by, I'm getting feedback from the kids on how they're doing. I'm giving them feedback and adjusting these expectations. So I'm so thankful that Sight Reading Factory student accounts exist, because we wouldn't have that ability to interact in that way where I'm getting to hear them sing every day. And that's been so awesome. So they're submitting these recordings and I get to hear them and remember what they sound like after a couple weeks, and it's been really fun. So many of you might have heard that Don at Sight Reading Factory is offering free accounts for kids for schools that are shut down during COVID-19. And that's awesome. What an awesome guy, what an awesome company. I decided that I'm going to continue purchasing the accounts because I have a budget to do it. And during this time where Don is giving away so much, we've got the money budgeted to purchase these accounts. So the kids that I had the last week that still didn't have accounts, we went ahead and bought some more just to try to keep some income coming in while Don's giving all this stuff away. So if you have the ability to do that, consider it. Consider helping out Don and his awesome company that way, and that would be an awesome thing. You can, of course, use Choralosophy at checkout and still get you 10% discount. So let me know. Send me an email, choralosophy@gmail.com, how you're using Sight Reading Factory. I would love to help tell some stories about some success stories there with how those things are being used, and any other online tool that you're really enjoying. So going forward, I hope you enjoyed this episode with Ryan Main and learning a little bit about becoming a composer. Well, I'm here in my actual recording studio with Ryan Main, which is really exciting. Of course, those of you who listen to the show and have since the beginning would recognize Ryan's name. He was one of our first sponsors to jump on board before there was even a show, which is an amazing leap of faith. So thank you for that. But I'm excited to have you here and to do a full episode, which will be our first.
Yeah.
So welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thrilled to be here.
Okay, so So my audience would, like I said, would know you from your publishing website that I've talked to them about quite a bit. But why don't you tell us the things that I wouldn't have told them about? Who is Ryan Main and where do you come from?
Sure. Well, I am from the Kansas City area. I grew up here, went to school just outside of Kansas City, and did my undergrad at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, which I think you graduated from as well. Yes, yeah.
What years?
2003 to 2006.
So I'm that much older than you. Okay. I just did the math.
I wouldn't have guessed. And after that, I did a master's program at the Peabody Institute and lived in Baltimore for a few years, and then came back to Kansas City in 2009 and started teaching. And that was, I was thinking about that on the drive over. That was right after the market had kind of imploded, and no one was retiring. And so I thought I was going to be able to find a great high school position somewhere. And what I found is that there was almost nothing open. So I ended up getting the only position that I could find, which was at this low-income school outside of Kansas City, middle school. And I ended up teaching there for 7 years, and it was trial by fire at first, but it absolutely forged me into a much better educator. Someone who I think was at the beginning kind of unaware of how to engage a room full of students who might not otherwise care about choral music.
Well, as most young teachers are.
Yes.
When they first start.
Yeah. That classroom management component is so interesting to me that I don't remember the phrase even being used in my education program, in my education classes, and just having that tidal wave of shock in the first few weeks of just class after class that, I had to get their attention and their respect and their focus and everything. And I was just, I was swimming in it for a while. Yeah. And I think I'm better for it. And it's made me someone who can now run an honor choir efficiently and that room awareness just comes naturally now, but man, that hurt for a while.
Yeah, I like to, the way I like to think of it too is like when I was a young teacher, I thought that I could win them over and win their attention and respect by impressing them. Which with kids that age, that's backwards.
Yeah.
They have to figure out that you're on their team, that you're on their side.
Yeah.
That you have to give them some reason to care what you say, and then maybe you can impress them.
Yeah.
But whereas I'd gone into the high school classroom for the second time in my life after having spent a couple of years as a grad ass at the collegiate level and teaching some college level courses, and where at that level they just were using me for my mind. Like they wanted to know what I know. And so I was in that, like, if I impress them, I can get them mode. And then I tried to take that back into high school.
Yeah.
And it was like, whoa, crash and burn is totally the opposite. Those kids hated me for 2 years until I could figure out that it's an interaction. It's a relationship first. And then, so yeah, that's totally normal. One of the things that in this episode that we were going to talk about anyway, since you're kind of talking about that first teaching job, was some of your first experiences looking at this group of kids that are in your classroom every day, maybe not always finding the music that is, once you got your feet wet, right, with those kids and you have that relationship, you start to learn what do they need musically.
Right.
And you maybe not always finding it when you go out and searching for it. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. What was that like?
Part of that was simply not knowing the repertoire. I, again, was planning to be teaching at a high school level and felt like I at least had a range of music that I could select from, and feeling like I was then going to zero and trying to figure that out.
Right.
So part of that was, I think, frankly, poor planning on my part, that I needed to learn the repertoire, learn what was out there. But once I started to dig in, I found that I would think that a piece might be successful, that it might work, and I would give it to my students, and there was something missing. The word that they would throw back at me often was cheesy. You know, if they felt that something was cheesy, sometimes I could just see it in their body language, in their faces. So I became very attuned to that very quickly. That what students perceive as being cheesy and what they perceive as being high quality. And then the added component of what is achievable for them in music that is high quality, and that can, when you're in the midst of trying to build a program and build sight reading skills and build all of the things that are going to make students successful, to find the music that is going to also engage them through that process, that isn't going to pique their cheesy radar, that can be very difficult. And just generally, I think middle school kids, my general observation is that they want to be seen as more mature. They want to do
than
music.
They are.
Yeah, and truly,
Right.
they want to do music that is in minor keys, and they want to do things that sound somewhat epic or intense, and so that's actually why I wrote DSE Ray, and I may be getting ahead of the conversation a bit.
That's great. That's the I've done that piece with kids, and I had that same experience that it gives them that, and I did it with ninth grade boys, and still, even though at that age, you're right. If it sounds impressive right away. Like you use the word epic. I think that's a great way to describe it. Then they get this kind of, their eyes go big and they're super excited. But then of course, actually one of the big challenges with that piece that I discovered was they can sing something that sounds cool on it the first time. Yeah. But then the challenge was, okay, guys, there's more to do. Yeah. Like, we can't just sing that opening statement or whatever and have it be like, and then they have that kind of Carmina Burana moment. But then, like, okay, guys, no, we have to fix that note and that rhythm, and like, okay. But that's what they need at that age. Like, you have, and I don't know if you noticed this, but I feel like that's more true with boys even than girls. Because like with the girls, I feel like there's so many different other ways I can win them over. With the boys, they have to feel like they sounded cool and sounded like epic or macho or whatever, and then you can hook them on other stuff. Like, then you can get them to sing the more sensitive love song later, or whatever. The dichotomy in the fall concert and the spring concert with boys, that always seemed a much wider terrain that we cover over time. Right. Yeah. So the DSE Ray was the first piece that you wrote for your own students?
It is, yeah. Okay. And I had kind of gotten my feet wet by writing warm-ups for them. Okay. But I also had studied composition in undergrad and grad school, and had some success in writing band music at the time. So I was not at all a choral composer. But I had this process of writing pieces, getting them through the stages of the composition process, then through the publishing process. So I was kind of coming to understand the publishing industry through this time, at least as someone who was published with a traditional band publisher, a traditional publishing house, and then was in teaching in schools. I was writing some exercises for my students, kind of along those same lines. I wanted our rehearsals to start with something, at least one thing that they felt sounded really cool, really epic. And it was around my third year of teaching that I had my first audition choir at the middle school level. And I wanted something that was really going to engage them, really going to challenge them and meet them where they were. But they were, that was the first year of an audition choir at a middle school. You know, if I wanted to get into syncopated rhythms, for example, that was going to be quite a bit of extra time. You know, DSE Ray was truly written to that group of students. Right. And when I did that, I couldn't have imagined for a moment that piece would get the level of would have the level of success that it's had. It's been performed around the world now, and I if you had told me that then, I would have scoffed. I would have said that's crazy.
Now, at the risk of making you be uncomfortable and talk about why it was successful, why do you think that is? Why did that piece do so well for you? What was it about it, do you think?
That's something I still I continue to think about that. So it checks all those boxes that we talked about. It has that epic feeling. It has some things, some immediate success moments along the way, and on top of that, I think the range obviously is something that works for that level. And it has enough meat on the bones as well. I think if DSE Ray were in degrees of difficulty, 2 or 3 degrees easier, I think it would actually be less successful than it is. Yeah, so that's something in my writing now. I really feel strongly that the text is going to be the thing that comes first. The art is very much right there, a tie for first. But then I'm immediately right after that thinking about those pragmatic elements of what's going to make this something that is going to work for a wide range of choirs. What is going to make this something that will make a lot more students successful. Well, so I have a very nerdy and very technical theory on why that piece is done so well for you. In case you're interested. So I've of course taught high school boys for 17 years, and Ryan's DSE Ray is probably the most successful piece I've ever put in front of my high school men's choir. That's awesome.
For a lot of reasons. But one of the things that I noticed is it kind of has all the things you mentioned. All the that epic feeling is big for high school boys, I've discovered. But also, when your voice is just changing or changed, there is one of the hardest things boys have to do when they're learning how to sing is get a note to be sustained for any amount of time and have it still be the same note half a second later. Because their voices have just doubled in size, like the actual mechanism itself has just doubled in size in the last 6 months or whatever, and they're still figuring out how much energy it takes to just hear a pitch, sing that pitch, and then have it stay there. Because it's I kind of liken it to somebody like maybe if a basketball player. This is a true story that happened to my father. My dad went home one summer, I think sophomore year of high school, at like 5'8". And came back as a junior at 6'3", and was a basketball player, and he felt like he had to completely relearn the amount of energy it took to play basketball. His body was bigger, and it was bigger all of a sudden. Well, our boys go through that. So the thing about DSE Ray is that with all the syncopated rhythms and the multiple, for those of you out there who don't know it, go check it out, of course, but then you'll know what I'm describing. Throughout the entire piece, it's asking them to re-articulate in various rhythms the pitch, and there's not as much sustaining a pitch for a super long amount of time. And I feel bad because I'm breaking your art down into like a mechanical, like...
No, this is fun for me. I like this.
Okay, good. And even when the boys are asked to sing like whole notes or long phrases of whole notes, the pitch changes pretty frequently in those lines. And I've discovered over many, many years that those types of vocal gymnastics are actually easier for boys that age than if you were to give them something lyrical and melodic and sustained. Because it forces them to re-engage their stomach muscles, to re-engage their articulators, which get the air going again, if that makes sense. And so since it has that, all those properties, and of course, the like you said, the level of difficulty is kind of right in that sweet spot. I think that when people hear it, say if they hear it performed at a convention or with an honor choir or whatever, it would be easy for a choir teacher who's been around high school boys for a while to envision, what, my guys could sing that. I think that's where a lot of the success comes from, is that it's challenging on an intellectual level, but it's very singable for the instrument that is in front of you.
Yeah.
And which was kind of the one of the main reasons I wanted to ask you that question or just dig into that piece a little bit, because
Sure.
I think for the audience that's listening, that was one of the main things I wanted to try to kind of drive home is if you've got a group of kids with some very particular needs in front of you and you can't find the piece, I think a lot of us would have the skill to either rearrange or to craft something that might be tailored for them. So the question I wonder, do you remember enough about the group that you wrote that for to like what were some specific things? Hey, these guys need this that you might remember from that time.
Yeah, well, I certainly had boys at the middle school level, of course. Many of us can relate to this, that had a range of about 4 to 5 good notes.
Yeah.
You know, that's where their voice was at that time during the change. And that's why you see so much of that repeated C natural.
Yep.
That was a power note for my boys, and that was what determined the key. That's what determined the tenor line in a lot of places. And then I actually, after I finished that piece, I would write in additional notes for my tenors. And I still have people emailing me all the time to say, can I write in this note here? And the answer is pretty much always yes. It was range first. It was some of those same issues that you were describing in the second, that the lyrical lines, keeping them somewhat brief, was very purposeful. At the Solvet Seklum section, you know, to then give them one full beat of rest after that. You know, that is informed by the text, but it's also informed by what the kids in the room could do.
Right.
And as you were talking about that, it made me think of something that I do that might be helpful for anyone who's writing. From the beginning, when I started writing for choir, I would write the piece or write portions of the piece and then sing every part. And no one told me to do it. It just seemed like I should that was the best way to check my voice leading, to see if it made sense for each singer. And I have found that that's something that continues to serve me really well, that I'm always making changes when I go back through and do that. That's something that I thought would make sense. For example, those bass notes moving, that came from checking that and realizing that their part was just a little too boring without that extra moving part. Where can I find some extra interest here? So then sing through it again. There it is. You know?
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. But beyond that, you also, if for example, you are a soprano or an alto and you're an educator and you want to write something for your students and you want to know if that's going to work for your boys, you can pull 5 of them out and say, hey, here's this short portion of this. Will you sing it for me? Plunk it at the piano, have them sing it back to you. Say, okay, what if we tried it this way instead? Have them do that. You know, boys are generally, in my experience, pretty willing to be your guinea pigs. If you don't tell them why, just say,
yes,
do this, do it now.
Less self-critical at the beginning.
Yeah.
Anyway. So how long after that after that DSE Ray, that experiment of writing for your own kids, were there other pieces later that you wrote still for your own kids before you became a composer?
Yeah,
full-time?
I did a lot of arranging. I arranged a lot of pop music for my kids.
Okay.
I found that I was not able to find pop arrangements for my students that would really work. For one reason or another, if it had a part just for the sopranos and altos, then just for the baritones. I find that's really common in pop settings, that just never seemed to work for my group. We just really functioned better when we were doing more things corporately. So I would arrange music like that for my students, and that was just great practice. And if I had decided to get into that publishing world of arranging pop music and publishing it, I think that's a really good way to go. I know I have several friends who've done really well that way. But I wrote DSE Ray, and it just kind of sat on a file on my computer for probably about 3 years before I tried to write anything else for choir. I didn't really see much of a purpose for writing more choir music because that was a world that I didn't really know. I was still being asked to write band music at the time, so I thought this is really, as a composer, where I have the most interest, where I have commissions. I have people wanting new music, so I'm going to keep writing that. But I found that as I was no longer living in the band world, I became rusty. I was writing things for bands that I would then go test. I would have bands play my music, and it just wasn't coming out the way that I was envisioning it in my head anymore. But meanwhile, anytime I wanted to create something for choir, it worked great, and that makes so much sense in hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
that you need to really know what it is if you want to jump into any kind of business endeavor. You really kind of need to be living in that world.
Right.
You know, I could try to start selling T-shirts tomorrow, and it probably wouldn't go very well because I just don't know that much about.
Not your industry.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So let's turn it around just for a second towards the listener who might be a teacher out there that maybe they don't want to go the route that you've gone and transition, which I want to talk about later,
Sure.
to being a composer full time. But maybe they do have this idea in their head that that the perfect piece for their kids isn't out there.
Mm-hmm.
If I could only just write them something. But maybe they haven't felt brave enough, or maybe they don't feel like they have the skill set. What is some advice you might give to just a classroom teacher that might want to take the plunge to create something?
Absolutely. My first piece of advice would be try. Just go for it. Yeah, there's truly no harm in putting notes on paper, or even putting those notes on paper in front of your kids and seeing what happens. If you don't like it, you're not obligated to follow through with it. You can pull it back and work on it more. Beyond that, some of the things that I hear from directors, from aspiring arrangers and composers, is I'm not a pianist. That's usually beyond, I think, just the fear of putting their voice out there in a way that could potentially receive some sort of criticism. I don't play the piano. I couldn't possibly write something for choir, but that's.
I'm struggling to see the connection. Why would someone think that?
Well, I think that too. Number one, you should know. I am not a pianist. I can sit at the piano and tinker about as well as any other choir director I know. Enough to play warm-ups, pretty much.
Yeah.
So that just doesn't really matter. You can write. So let's take an example. If you've never written something before, but you sometimes feel like you listen to music and think vaguely, I could do something better than that. I know I could, but I'm not sure how. I think what you start with is something preformed, like a folk song.
Okay.
Start there. Start with just the melody and just chords in the piano. You don't need to do anything else in the piano beyond whole notes. Start with a folk melody and whole notes. Can you create something new with that has not been created before? And the answer is almost always yes. So can you then find something in the chord progression that is going to make your students' eyebrows raise somewhere along the way? That they're singing this folk melody, they're having great success with their part of it, and then also the eyebrows go up. Oh, that chord was cool. That was different. Once you have those components, then the next steps are pretty easy. I usually keep my accompaniments very simple in the writing process, and I start adding harmony. I start adding maybe a canon. Pretty simple compositional devices can get you a really long way. So canon is one, of course. Simple two-part harmony, starting with unison, finding ways in which the melody can break off. Do we hold this G in a C major chord for 4 beats? What if then the altos sang G, F, E for a half note? All of a sudden you have this really easy to sing line that has become infinitely more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And you can teach that in 60 seconds.
Yeah.
How to sing that.
So make sure I'm following you. So
Sure.
It sounds like the process you're describing, which does make a whole lot of sense intuitively, could almost be happening live in front of the kids.
Oh, yeah.
Is that what you're intending?
Yeah, and there were times where I pretty much did it that way. Maybe again with a warm up.
Yeah.
And I got to work that muscle, I think, quite a bit. Just having my students do interesting new things while I would also play some pretty simple chord progressions on the piano.
Right.
And we would usually do those on solfege or on a neutral vowel, so that we were always working something that was also going to translate well into what their actual music was. But I was also just honing a skill that I really didn't realize how useful that would be.
Yeah, that's great. I think that your instinct there is for the average teacher in the room who just feels like they need to create something for, I see these posts on Facebook all the time of, hey, what's some music I could do for my class that has 14 sopranos and 3 altos and 2 tenors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of course, the answer is almost always going to be there isn't any.
Yeah.
But nobody has the heart to say that to that person on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
So they start listing all of these things you could almost like, you could do this piece, but you'd have to put a round peg in a square hole still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so those are the types of situations that stick out to me as a, if the choir teacher starts to develop, like you said, that muscle of arranging at least first, you could create something to divide those 14 sopranos up into smaller groups that do different things throughout the piece, and they have different roles to play in the story or whatever it is, and make something truly custom to your students. Now, I wonder if you buy this argument too, that the reason that doesn't happen more is because there's not much commercial use for it.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, once you created that piece for 14 sopranos and 3 tenors or whatever, no one's going to buy it because
right.
That's not your situation.
And I think some of that is perception. I think and I base that off of how many people in those same groups I see offering to give music away for free.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that there's a right or wrong there, but I had a very emphatic professor in grad school who looked me in the eye and said, "You will never give your music away for free. You cannot do that if this is something that you ever intend to have as a career."
Mm-hmm.
That because I had just done it. I had just written a piece for free for someone, and that lecture was very painful for me because I thought I had done a good thing, an altruistic thing, and maybe I had, but his reasoning was that if you are creating something of value, or let me reframe that. If someone else wants to do it, it is of value.
Mm-hmm.
It is of value. And you can set that value at whatever you want. I could sell my music for $1 and presumably more people would perform it. But there would probably also be more copies on the floor somewhere that were, when I set the value at $1, that's what everyone else is going to set the value at as well.
They will devalue it because you did.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And that's a lesson that translates into more portions of our lives too. But I think that person that you're describing who has 14 sopranos, 3 altos, 2 tenors. Sure. Now I'm intrigued about this piece. But I think that same material with, let's say, an extra 2-3 days of work, maybe 3 hours on 3 Saturdays, after you've had this piece successfully performed with your students, you now have intellectual property. Mm-hmm. You have something that you have created that did not exist before and is of whatever value you assign to it. Mm-hmm. Will others buy into that? That's where the market comes into play, and you should be aware of whether or not the value you assign will be bought into on a wider level. But you've created this intellectual property. Maybe that is your ensemble. But can that same material be adapted for a wider range of students? Can you have an SAT voicing with I'm assuming a very simple T part in this
Right.
instance?
Yeah. Right.
But is there also a way for you to add a B part? Can you have an SA, parentheses T, B piece? Right. If you have the skills to get those notes on paper, you have the skills to get more notes on paper, or to rework the notes in such a way that all you have to do is think about someone else's choir then. There's this other choir director across town who has a really rockin' SAB ensemble, but it's an older set of Bs. So what if the same material were to be imagined for them? What would that look like?
Yeah, so it could be that the mindset that you're suggesting could be that teacher in that classroom with an oddly voiced group, maybe they're thinking, I don't want to go through a lot of work to create this custom piece because I will have done it all that work, and then this group is going to all leave my classroom next year anyway. It's going to be different. Why would I go through all that work? And maybe one possible answer is if you just took that extra step and maybe you created something really cool that other people could get use of. So you make the version for your kids first, and then you could later say in your head, how would I expand this piece if I had all the singers I wanted?
Yeah.
And then what it could have become. And then you've got something you could potentially sell.
Absolutely.
And you've got you could put in, like a lot of composers do, the optional note or whatever. And that way it could work for your kids still, but it could also work for the choir across town that might have all those singers and all that stuff. That makes a lot of sense, which I think is a perfect transition into one of the other things we were going to talk about, which was that process that started in your classroom for you. Tell us a little bit about how that evolved into finally a decision where I'm not going to teach anymore in the classroom. I'm just going to be a composer, and do all of that. Tell us that story.
Yeah, that's quite a journey. So I'll have to go back in time for a moment there to my band music being published. And for those who maybe don't know what that looks like for the composer in that scenario, if you're working with a traditional publishing house, composer traditionally makes about 10% of the sales. So if the score costs $70 for a band director to buy, I would make $7 every time that's purchased.
Okay.
So that's purchased 10 times, that's $70. 100 times, that's $700. Am I doing the math right?
Sounds about right.
Great.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty exciting thing, but I think you could do the math all the way through and find that it would take a tremendous amount of continual sales at that level to be able to earn an actual living,
right?
To be able to keep the lights on in your house and buy groceries. So I as I got busier with teaching and my program was growing, and I was finding that I absolutely loved making choral music, I also found that it was becoming harder for me to find the time to write music for band that I knew would be published through this platform, that if my publisher liked it, it would make a certain level of sales, and that if they felt just okay about it, it might make almost nothing, and that it was taking a tremendous amount of time, especially during the school year, to find the time to write these pieces. And so my interest in that just kind of waned as I was around the same time starting to write music for my choir. I had already written Dies Irae. I was starting to think of some other music for them, and I thought, this is something that I need to take a chance here. I need to do something different than that. I have this one piece. I think people will like it. And I wish I'd known just how true that would be.
Yeah.
But I knew I had something of some value, and that I also love writing music. I'd known that since I was 18 years old, and I first sat down at a piano for the first time, and I just didn't get up for about 5 hours. I would sit and play for hours a day, and I knew that creating something from nothing was interesting to me.
Yeah.
So I had been really interested in composers in this other realm, the band world, who were self-published and what that looked like. So I started reading up on some of those guys. John Mackey is usually the first name that's thrown out. And he had a blog, and it probably still does, where he goes over some of the nuts and bolts of self-publishing for band. And I read that blog cover to cover, so to speak, and just learned as much as I could about how one could put their music out without a middleman, and just from me to the customers, to the other directors, the people who I knew and worked with, and how could I get this in their hands in a way that was sustainable, that could eventually turn into a living. And that's when I came up with my website, and I use a content management. I'm trying to remember what it's called. CMS, content management system. Weebly is what I use.
Okay.
Just like Squarespace or any other.
So just to make sure I'm tracking the chronology here,
sure.
reinvent.com started before you had cut the tie off your teaching, or after?
Before.
So so you had that, like a monkey on a branch, you had hold of the teaching, the job still, and you started the website.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it wasn't long before I had, I want to say in that first year, and that was my final year of teaching, when I had music on my website that people could purchase and download.
Right.
It probably sold maybe 10 copies total.
In the first year?
In the first year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't want to give anyone the illusion that this is going to be something that feels fast, but I think now when I describe it, that was about 5 years ago, and now I'm making a full-time living as a composer.
Right.
So that is actually pretty fast in the grand scheme. Yeah. But at the time, it doesn't feel like it. When you first get started, you are investing time and energy into something that's not going to necessarily pick up steam very quickly. But that was enough for me to see.
Kind of feels like starting a podcast.
Yeah, I can imagine so. But luckily, I think any director who's ever started a program or taken over a program that is small and had potential to grow, I think luckily a lot of the people who are listening to this will know that feeling of both looking back over the course of a few years and seeing what is clearly tremendous growth, and then also being in the day-to-day when it does not feel like tremendous growth. It feels like a whole lot of work.
It feels tedious. So
yeah, it certainly can, yeah. But I was inspired. I was inspired by the fact that I had taken the advice of some of these other composers who had struck out on their own, and that on some level it was working.
Right.
That I didn't have zero sales.
Yeah.
I had some sales. And that was enough for me now this is where I'm getting out of the realm of advice and more into what I did.
Right.
And what I did is I sold my house that I had many years of equity in. I quit my teaching job, and I got a job that was going to be able to help me migrate. Essentially, it was an interim position at a large church.
Okay.
So it was able to make up for some of that deficit. But I took this money, the equity in my home, and I used that as my emergency fund, basically. Okay. That if I was not able to make a living doing this, that's what was going to keep the lights on. And by my math, I had about 1 to 2 years to see whether I was going to be able to be successful doing this. And I did. The first year was somewhere in the area of maybe $500, and then the graph is essentially exponential the next few years after that.
So, $500 in sales.
Yes.
Your first year on the website.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
So when along that process, then in that 5-year journey, did you start incorporating some other publishing methods? Like you have some stuff on J.W. Pepper and all of that. So how did that fold into the whole?
I really that kind of fell into my lap. So J.W. Pepper contacted me because someone had programmed Dies Irae on for an honor choir in some other part of the country, and this was the first they'd heard of it. So they contacted me as now a publisher, and they wanted to know how they could get that music into the J.W. Pepper system so that they could include it in the packet, essentially for this. And I had no idea. This was a completely new thing to me. So I again, it was kind of a trial by fire to figure out how to work with them. That was the first time that I'd worked with a retailer before, and I just asked around, and I set a percentage that J.W. Pepper would get for those scores, and I was still printing, or I should rephrase that. Everything had been digital up to that point, but I knew that J.W. Pepper was going to need a physical score, so I started printing. I just got a printer, and I was printing the scores, and I was still hand stapling the scores for a while there, and sending those off. And as these things go, that's how I started. I found better methods as I went. I eventually found a company called Black Ribbon that would print my scores for several years after that. And they do what's called print on demand, which is the order comes in from Pepper, it gets forwarded to them, they send the music to Pepper, and so on. But what had been a pretty exciting growth process up to that point then kind of took off, because I found what I thought was that print music is dead, and that digital downloads are the future. And that's, I think, partially true. I think that digital downloads are the future.
We're just not quite there yet.
We're not quite there yet. There is still a tremendous market for print music, and I think that's fair. We probably all know some directors who are just more comfortable buying music from a retailer and getting what looks like a professionally printed score for whatever reason. Even if there's a copy license saying it's okay to make copies of this, it just makes them uncomfortable to be dealing with Xerox in cheap music. So in any case, so that music that you see on Pepper is still published by me. At some point along the way, Pepper developed their own print-on-demand program. So now J.W. Pepper, I work with them and they print the scores. But if you purchase a piece through my website, I now have a company that prints and ships those out. And so really what I'm describing is now supply lines, that I started to figure out what the supply line is, where customers can find my music, and what is that line then? The customer finds it at Stanton's, and it goes to my email, and then it goes to my distributor, or the customer orders it on Pepper, and it goes directly back to the customer. Pepper sends me a report at the end of the month. And so that's what it looks like now. But I should maybe take this moment to say, if anybody out there is thinking about doing this and they want some more nuts and bolts details like that, just email me, and I will tell you literally everything I know, because I think that if I can do this, anyone can do it. I really believe that. And I also think that it's just so much fun to be on this journey of figuring out how to make a living creating music, that I truly want to help other people do that too. Well,
and being on the cutting edge in a lot of ways of, or I don't even say the cutting edge, but like it's almost like you're in as part of a exploratory committee on what the future of choral music publishing might look like.
Yeah.
It's possible that the Ryan Main method of self-publishing is not the answer for the future.
Right.
But there are other, like Jake Renestad and some of those
Mm-hmm.
folks that kind of do their own thing. Sidney Guillaume,
Mm-hmm.
that maybe they've got some processes that are unique to them that you don't do. But what I think all of you are doing is kind of creating some laboratories of experimentation
Yeah.
in a field that, of course, has been dominated for decades and decades, centuries of physical sheet music,
Right.
publishing and printing and shipping and all of that. And so, yeah, I find that interesting. Just the aspect of removing the gatekeepers, a lot of ways of who gets to decide what music is worthy.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting aspect of it too. That I think I'd be interested to know what your thought is, because in your situation, the only person that loses if you spend a bunch of time writing the piece that you just think is fantastic, but everybody else thinks it sucks, you are the only one that loses.
Right.
Whereas in the old method, somebody else has to decide a priori almost if the work that you just did was worthy, and if that other person decides that it wasn't, then we would never know. We will never know if those pieces are
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I had that experience. I had music that the first piece I ever published for band kind of skewed my perception of that a bit, because that piece was something that they liked very much, that they put a lot of energy and marketing behind, and did very well. And then pretty much everything after that was some variation of a lesser experience than that, including at least one piece that they did choose to publish. And again, I am grateful to them. I truly am. But this did inform what I wanted to do in the future. So that aside, they chose to publish a piece, but it just was apparent that it wasn't something that they really thought was a great piece. It was more, I think, an effort to keep me engaged as a composer working with them, and to keep the door open to future compositions. So they published the piece, and it was in no print catalogs, it was in no marketing, it was in nothing, essentially. And it did next to zero sales. But that was a piece that I liked very much.
Right.
I thought was good.
Right.
And what I found now, and in honesty, that was very frustrating. As a composer, when you spend the time, like you said, to create something, you become emotionally connected to it.
Yeah, I would hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And even to this day, Dies Irae was 8 years ago now that I wrote that piece. And I still get a thrill getting to hear a new group sing it every single time. And I knew that was just something that I didn't want to do anymore. I didn't want to have a third party involved who was going to assign value and potentially block others from getting to make that decision on their own. So self-publishing has been really gratifying in that way, and I have had pieces that it's just really fun to get to be the person on the front-facing side of the business, getting to interact with customers one-on-one and to hear their impressions. And I've had pieces that I thought were absolutely great that have done fine, have done okay. And I've sometimes been surprised. I have a piece called Go Said the Star that I love very much, but I just didn't realize when I wrote it just how hard the accompaniment is. You really pretty much need a rock star accompanist. And that's really caused that piece to not be as successful as I thought that it would be. So
the conductor pulls it up and looks at the perusal score and thinks, my accompanist can't play this.
Yeah.
Next.
Right. Yeah. Or my accompanist might be able to play this, but it's going to be a lot of work, and they've already got this many other things going on, or it's contest season, and it's a very fair decision. I've done the same thing as a director many times, and I have also had pieces. So this is more recent now. I wrote a piece called "How Can I Face This World," and it is easily the darkest and least hopeful piece of music I've ever written. But it was the poetry, it was the commission. This is what the group wanted, and I was really hesitant to take that on, but I really lived inside that poetry for the better part of 2 months as I worked on that piece. And it's true, if you ever hear artists talk about creating something that has some darkness to it, that it really kind of affects your worldview for this period of time.
Right.
But just this past week, I got to work with a choir who was doing that piece, and I think they're only the third choir that's performed it yet. But the degree to which these students just loved this music kind of invigorated my own perception of the piece.
Right.
That I actually see quite a bit more value in it now, hearing how they connected it to their own lives and their own experiences. And frankly, I just hadn't looked at the music in about 8 months. And I looked at it again with their fresh eyes, and I like that piece quite a bit more now.
Yeah.
And I think that there's actually a tremendous value in it, in the message. And there is hope in the piece too.
Right.
But it's doing what I do now is not just better financially. It is better for my art. It's better for my heart. I didn't mean for those to rhyme, but they did. It's better. I think just for me as a person to be more optimistic about the future of my own career.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, you are you and some of the other composers I mentioned that are self-publishing are you are the Uber of the choral world.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever thought of it in your own head that way, but in a lot of ways you represent the larger trend in my mind economically of the gig economy, the one-to-one peer-to-peer economy, where like I mentioned before, the gatekeepers of the industry being kind of the old-fashioned way to look at it, that somebody gets to decide other than the artist and the consumer. Like you said earlier, removing the middleman. I personally believe that not only is that the future of choral music, but that's the future of almost everything we do. As technology allows us to eliminate more and more of the middleman. I mean, people are now using Amazon to sell their own products directly to people.
Yeah.
Things like that. Like you get the opportunities to reach more people. So it'll be interesting to see if that old way of doing it lasts our lifetime. I imagine we will still have in the span of our lifetime, assuming we don't get downloaded into AIs or something before we die. But that we probably will still see traditional publishers around. But I bet you, my personal guess is that it won't last my children's lifetime. That by that point, there might still be a company called Edition Peters or whatever, but they're going to be all doing digital too.
I tend to think so as well, and I think as one market dwindles, it also tends to consolidate, and so I think that in our lifetimes we might see it work its way down into a handful of larger, more expansive publishing houses, but not the many that we've had.
Right.
And that may be good.
And the ones that will survive are going to be the ones that adapt.
Yes,
to the new technology, and that they embrace it, and that they look ahead and say, we're not going to be able to do it the way we're doing it now 20 years from now.
Yeah.
And the ones with foresight in that area will be the ones that survive, and the ones that hold on to the past are the ones that die. But that's, again, true of every industry we've seen for the last 200 years. Yeah. So yeah, that's all very great. So let's wrap up with this. Anything that you would like the audience to know about, or things that you just that you wanted to say and I didn't give you a chance?
Oh gosh, we covered a lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I actually do.
How about next big composing project that people might want to know about?
Sure. Well, I just had two pieces, or three pieces actually, that I just published. One is called The Birth of Music. That was written for a choir in the area at Olathe East High School. And I just am in absolute love with the poetry. And in a lot of ways, I actually see it as a piece that pairs with how can I face this world. And certainly not that you need to program it that way, but it is something that starts in a fairly dark place and ends up with just great hope and optimism for the future. So that was quite a bit more fun to write, frankly. So I'm very excited about that piece. I have a piece that came out recently called Three Things. Very simple. Any of your groups could sight read it, but then there's great music to make with it after that. Also, just really neat poetry written by a high school student at the time.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a piece called The Future Now that I think is just kind of ideal for a pretty rockin' high school choir who can dig into a lot of energy, a lot of movement, and in the music, and really great poetry. Again, kind of optimistic, and I think for high school juniors and seniors looking at their next steps in life, that's something that's a great conversation starter. So I really didn't mean to plug my own music so much here, but that is what I'm excited about.
Yeah,
I'm excited.
Because anyone who's listening that thinks they might want to go on a journey like this, you're going to have to also be excited about your own music, and you're and you don't have a marketing team,
right?
So that has to be you. You have to be the one that goes out and plugs it.
That's something that I have been very intentional about. Is what I put on Facebook. That is my marketing team. Essentially, is just every time that I go to work with a choir, that is a true blessing in my life that someone's chosen to perform my music. So I'm going to lift them up. I'm going to find something awesome about that experience and tell the world about it. And beyond that, it's like you said, to just be excited about your own music and to try to find the ways in which you can put that out there that are authentic. I try not to comment on every I'm a choir director post that where I could potentially, but if I think it's going to really help somebody and give them the option they're looking for, then there I am.
Yeah. No, I support that. I think that's really important. I've always said that every professional in every other industry has to advertise. Musicians are no different. You've got to figure out a way to communicate who you are, what you do, why you do it, why somebody should interact with you professionally. And I think people shouldn't shy away from that.
Right.
That's really, really important. So thank you so much for coming all the way out to the suburbs and recording in my studio. This is fun.
I love it. I've been wanting to see the new studio.
Yeah, it's going to be great. So of course the audience that does watch on YouTube will get to see the other half of the room. Which is great.
This is pretty nice right here.
Yes,
like
and let's look into the camera too, just so we can prove that even though I am about 5 or 6 years older, Ryan has a much grayer beard than I do. So I just would like to point that out.
It's true.
To the YouTube channel. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. This is fun. Well, thank you as always for sticking around to the end of an episode. That means I hope that you got something out of this conversation. Maybe you found it interesting, or maybe you found it helpful, or both. If that's the case, there are things you can do to support the mission of this show. And I ask humbly and for your help in these ways, if you can and if you're willing. First thing is subscribe if you haven't. Like the Facebook page, follow on Twitter, follow on Instagram, connect with me as many ways as you possibly can, send feedback to choralosophy@gmail.com, or even better, post your feedback on the Choralosophers Facebook page. These are all ways to continue keeping the audience engaged. It helps me come up with topics, to be honest. The more feedback and energy I get from you guys as listeners, the better it helps me come up with what it is that you guys want to hear about. So that's a really interactive part of making a show like this, especially now that I'm a year and 2 months or so into this process. of creating content so far, guys. There's been almost 40 segments posted and upwards of 50 to 55 hours or so of content posted on the Choralosophy podcast. That's a lot of work, and one of the best ways for you to help me with that work is to give me ideas for the future, and your interactions are very, very helpful with for that. The other ways that you can help, of course, are to support our sponsors. They are doing a lot of awesome work out there. I choose to only affiliate with companies that I believe in. So Sight Reading Factory, obviously, I believe in. RyanMain.com, obviously. Voce Vista Video is also an amazing product that you probably won't be able to use until your kids are back in the classroom, but playing with it right now is a great idea. Getting familiar with how Voce Vista works. Don't forget, you can download a free copy for 30 days of at vocevista.com/choralosophy and play with it to see if it's something you would like to use in your classroom. And then last but not least, graphitepublishing.com is another sponsor of the show, and you can use Choralosophy at checkout on all 4 of those websites and get 10% off. And that helps me a lot because it helps them know that you're listening. And that's a really, really cool thing. And of course, you can check out our Patreon. There's a patreon.com/choralosophy as well for the diehards that really get a lot out of this show, and you feel like you want to help me with $3 a month or $5 a month to help me cover the costs of doing the show. As I've been saying since the beginning, my goal is always to cover the costs. So far, the show has covered its costs over the course of the first year, but more costs continue to come in, advertising and hosting and all the different things that go into making a show like this, equipment, that kind of stuff. So over the first year, we've just about broken even. And that Patreon can help me continue to do that so that I can do this show and create content for you, and 50 hours or whatever a year of content for you. If you find it helpful, it's awesome if you can turn around and help me in that way. So thank you so much. Keep listening and keep offering feedback. We'll see you next time.